What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is spirituality? Spirituality. Spirituality. How do they divert? How do they divert? How do they divert? How do they convert? How do they convert? How do they convert? How are we different? How are we different? How are we different? How are we the same? How are we the same? How are we the same? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is spirituality? Spirituality.
Hi, this is Angelo John Lewis for the Diversity and Spirituality Network. Today it's my honor to interview Siobhan Chandler, a sociologist of religion, who specializes in the study of a segment of the population who are what she calls spiritual but not religious, or SBNRs. This is a category of believers who some claim are as much as 25% of the North American population. Siobhan wrote her doctorate on the social ethic of religiously unaffiliated spirituality, which is the first full-length study of SBNRs in Canada. She's been a visiting fellow at the Center for Studies of Religion and Society at the University of Victoria and has given numerous talks and written numerous papers on this segment of the population. Siobhan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Angelo. Thanks for having me.
So, Siobhan, before we get into a discussion of spiritual but not religious, can you give me some sense as to how Siobhan the person fits into that group?
Yeah, sure. I think I'm actually like a lot of people these days. When I reached my adult years, I didn't have a religious upbringing, and I wanted to know more about what sort of spiritual offerings were available. And so I started doing my own research and got involved with a lot of different things over the years. And then at a certain point along the way, I went back to school. I have an undergraduate degree in psychology, and then I wanted to do a master's degree in religious studies. And what I wanted to understand was, what was this thing that I was doing? Because I heard it called New Age, but I didn't think I was New Age. And certainly the people I knew didn't think they were New Age. So I didn't really know what to call it. That was the first thing. And I couldn't understand, and this was really a big question that didn't get resolved until I finally finished my PhD, was what's holding this thing together? Like, how come I would be drawn to the same things in sometimes the same order as other of my spiritual friends, and we were doing it, but we weren't consulting each other and deciding. It just seemed to be this tendency to choose to do the same, to choose to do and believe the same types of things. But from a religious studies point of view, that shouldn't really be possible, because religions are generally transmitted through the institution. So I couldn't figure out how it was working so well without any oversight. So that was really the big question that I wanted to understand when I got involved with it.
You know, what I like to do here, and I know it's not on my script, but I think it's an interesting place to start. Hopefully you'll think so too. You know, these terms are a little bit loaded. So, I mean, what is your sense as to what spiritual means, number one? And then what is your sense as to what religion means?
Yeah, when I first started studying this or writing about it or giving talks about it, I went down the typical road of religion is institutional, spirituality is personal. And that works pretty well for just a general conversation. But the deeper you go down that rabbit hole, it starts to break down a little bit. Particularly these days, we have a lot of, the millennial generation in particular aren't fond, many of them, of the term spiritual. The term spiritual, I think, is becoming so, I want to say flaccid, because it's just overused. It's used for so much. It's doing way, way too much. And so religion, I can go to the university and study religion, but I can't really go there and study spirituality. It's too amorphous. And the movement, the spiritual but not religious movement, we're actually trying to define the thing with a negative definition. We can only really say what those people aren't, but we're not saying what they are with that definition. And so it's a bit of a mess, and it's perfectly serviceable for just, like I said, general conversations, or people want to say I'm spiritual but not religious, that's fine. But if you want to take a scholarly approach to this, which I've been doing, it's very challenging. And there's a lot of hoops to jump through in order to make sure people are talking about the same thing and they're using the terms in the same way.
You know, what I've read, I read the Pew study thing, which I'm certain you're familiar with. It basically talks about the decline of religious observance per se, and the sort of the ascent of people who it's like they're okay with the word that they're spiritual or something, but they don't define themselves as religious, which is kind of a roundabout way of getting to what we're talking about. But give me a sense as a general demographic, the general demographic shift that seems to be underway with the observance of religion or decline of it. Maybe start there.
So there's a lot of ways to answer that, and just in terms of a general answer, the way that I'm a sociologist of religion, so I tend to use sociological categories to think about this phenomenon, and that's not the only way. So I just want to put that out there. But the way that I understand spiritual but not religious, what's happening there is connected to modernization, this very broad process called modernization. It's been going on for hundreds of years, but it really started to accelerate after the scientific revolution. And then now what we have going on, I mean, I don't need to tell your listeners that we're dealing with a rate of change that's dizzying. So we've got modernization proceeding at a very rapid pace now. And what modernization does is it basically promotes a lot of autonomy. And so, people are more educated. That's one of the hallmarks of modernization. You've got I just read something recently about in Canada, which is where I live, that we're one of the most educated countries in the world with, I can't remember the exact percentage, but it was a very high percentage of people who have a university degree. And so when you get an educated population, and education is only one parameter, you find that people are more rational, ideally anyway, but they are very much less likely to take things on faith, especially when one of the big hallmarks of modernization also is the rise of science, the scientific paradigm. And so we have a much more rationally minded, educated public who they don't want to take things on faith. And so religion is really suffering from this explosion of education, I guess, is one way of thinking about it.
Yeah, I wonder, do you see, does globalization come into what you're talking about, modernization? I'm with that, but I wonder, does globalization fit into
that's another pillar
what
of
you're talking
it.
about?
So we're all exposed to things that are happening in other countries. They're exposed to what's going on here and so on. And so there's a blending of ideas, and it's much easier for people to share information, obviously. So globalization is a big part of the spirit of spiritual but not religious, which is really seeking a commonality in a sense. What's the baseline? What are some of the most basic truths we can say about who we are as people and the human experience? And so whereas religion often is perceived as, I wouldn't say it actually does this, as promoting exclusivity, spirituality is more perceived as promoting inclusivity. And globalization as a macro process does promote a type of inclusion.
And I imagine there's some sort of displacement in terms of the idea that religion is going to create a context for shared meaning with this modernization and globalization. There's sort of a displacement, or I'll call it. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it quite well. In other words, like if I'm in my regional thing where I grew up in a particular church, I have a sense of shared identity with my fellows. And then this globalization happens and modernization happens. I've got more information about the way other people see things, which are maybe different from the group that I come from. That creates a kind of, it's like my religious thing isn't working for me in a certain sense.
What's happening? Displacement's an interesting word to use to describe secularization, because I think that it is quite, I mean, religion plays such an important role in culture. And, it gets a bit of a bad rap these days. We can get caught up in looking at some of the more negative aspects of what religion does. But in my research, one of the things I focused on was all the really positive things that religion does. It's religious people, they volunteer more, they give more to charity, they do an awful lot of good for the society. And so there's a fear that with religions declining, that society is going to suffer, and that this new type of spirituality isn't really robust enough to take the role that religion has played. And so there are definitely people that, if I'm understanding what you're saying, do feel that there is this sort of negative displacement of religion, the role that religion has historically played.
So let's get around to the nub of the question. What is this thing called spiritual but not religious? I mean, what does that mean? What is their percentage in the society? What do they think?
Yeah,
I know there's a lot of different questions in there. You can start anywhere you want.
If you go and check out my blog, when I started writing that blog, I wanted to try and address some of these questions because they're the questions I get asked all the time. And they're not that easy to answer. The thing about spiritual but not religious, it comes back to what I was saying earlier about the name itself. Who is spiritual but not religious? Who are we talking about when we use that term? And what you find is that within that master kind of category, or that big category of spiritual but not religious, there's a lot of diversity. It's quite, for instance, you would have the people that would be into meditation. You would have the people that might be into angels or UFOs, or maybe they're what we call, the tree hugger type, or very affluent people, not so affluent people. I mean, it's a real range. So it's a very big percentage of the population if you use a very broad definition. And so the research that's coming out now from the States, and certainly the research I did in Canada, you can see is growing year by year. One of the measures that we can use is not perfect to talk about, how this is shaping up is this category called no religion. So in survey research now, they're starting to track this, people who are not identifying with any particular religious category. And so we're seeing a rise in these religious nones, both in the States and in Canada. So that's one way we can get a snapshot of people who are saying no to conventional religion. Maybe people, just correct this among your listeners if you are under the impression that people who say they are not religious or have no religion are atheists, is not what we're finding to be the case. There's just a lot of confusion out there about how people identify what it is they do believe. And I think for people of an older generation, they don't want to be called New Age. That's not appealing for most people. And they are looking for a better term. Maybe they don't know it. One of the questions I asked when I did my survey, I asked people, if you were at a dinner party and someone asked you your religion, how would you respond? And the answers were crazy. There was such a range, agnostic, heretic, mystic, no fixed address, you name it, like just this crazy mixture of responses. And really what it pointed to was the fact people don't know what to call what they're doing, which when I started our interview, that's what I said. I didn't know how to really describe what I was doing. That's what I was curious about. And so anyway, we've come up with this big category. It's very messy. I would say, just as a real ballpark, you could say, if you use a very broad definition, maybe, and this is generous, I'll admit it, maybe you might see half the population wrapped up in a definition, a very broad definition of spiritual but not religious. But if you start to take it down to more specific sets of beliefs and values, you're going to see that number shrink down to maybe 9%. It just depends how you slice the pie.
One thing that I'm curious about, is this a American, U.S., Canadian phenomenon, or is it a worldwide phenomenon? What's your sense?
Well, it's absolutely for certain taking over in the Western world, because we have rapid modernization and all the consequences of that. In industrializing countries, you start to see the same pattern emerge. But I haven't actually studied it in a great detail, so I don't want to say anything that's incorrect because I don't know, and it is a bit complex, although I have had discussions with different people, and sometimes quite surprising to find in parts of the world where I wouldn't necessarily expect there to be a scholarship on this type of phenomenon happening. It is actually happening. So I'm inclined to say that it is moving towards being a global phenomenon, although there's definitely places in the world right now, and that for sure it's not happening, at least not in any widespread way.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. Just a little bit as an aside, I recently did a workshop by a guy who I'm going to call a New Thought leader named Frederick Dotson. And, he fits into the category of science of, law of attraction, things of that nature. And much to my surprise, about, I would say, a fifth of the workshop were people from Saudi Arabia and Morocco, places like that. Places where you would not expect people would even dream of something like this. So, I mean, I don't know the answer, and you don't know the answer in terms of how widespread it is throughout the world. But there seems to be, I think we can say safely that there are pockets of people that fit into this, as you call it, very sort of amorphous,
and I think that, again,
to
what you're
capture
saying
category.
there points to the reality of globalization, is nobody's really cut off. I mean, yeah, sure, there's countries where there is limited access to internet and such, but for the affluent in particular, there's not a lot of barriers.
So you started this before, Siobhan, but how would you characterize some of the various subgroups that fit into this SBNR rubric?
I worked a lot on that over the years, trying to nail it down, but I think the problem with that is when I have conversations with people who are spiritual but not religious, invariably they do something to upset my paradigm. So they're just not fitting neatly into those boxes that I made. And so I'm less in favor of trying to do it. But there's, like I said, there are definitely different trends that you see within spiritual but not religious. You have, for instance, the quantum physics crew, people who are very into science and see quantum physics as kind of a hope for the future. Movies like What the Bleep Do We Know, things like that would be in that. Then you have people who are, and this again is a very important thing to understand about spiritual but not religious, is that even though the name is not religious, there's a lot of religious people who call themselves spiritual but not religious. And what I understand that to mean is they're practicing their religion in a way that doesn't compromise their integrity. So they're not putting their personal beliefs on hold. They may go to church, synagogue, temple, whatever, and want to be part of that community and respect the traditions, but they're not willing to go all the way with all of the beliefs, particularly if they infringe on their personal freedoms is a big one. So we've got, like I said, this incredible mishmash. You've got religious SBNRs, spiritual but not religious SBNR, religious SBNRs that might be going about it in a certain way. You might have people who are very into the esoteric. And you have also now, which we're really seeing come online in a big way, is these, as I said, the millennials, they've got their own spin on it. You can look at it by generation. That's not a bad way to do it. There's people that are very, let's put it this way. When I was researching, and again, based on hundreds and hundreds of conversations I've had over the years, I noticed that more affluent people, they don't want to have any, they don't want to be considered flaky, basically. Let's just call it what it is. And so they tend to align with things that are more intellectual, the more intellectual side of it. And Buddhism is very popular with that crowd. So, this kind of non-dualistic philosophy and making it sound very, elevated and want to be very intelligent about how they go about it. And then you have another group that are more into the experiential side of it, who want to feel something. And so you find in that group, energy healers, people who are very into things like Reiki and energy modalities. A huge subgroup are people that do yoga, and that can mix and match with all those other categories. Again, yoga is expensive. It does tend to attract people who are on the upper end of the socioeconomic spectrum. And that's another real bias in the research, is that I think we don't necessarily know a lot about people who are doing this who might be in a lower income bracket. And I mean, I think that one of the stereotypes is that there's a sort of a parallel between being more traditionally minded and having being in a lower income bracket. And these are huge possible problems in terms of really coming to grips with what this actually is. I'll just say this last thing before I let you jump in, is that it really can be quite expensive to live as a spiritual but not religious person if you want to take advantage of, week-long workshops and buying essential oils and all these different things they have now, like decks of cards. And, even if you want to practice yoga, yeah, you can do it at your community center, or you can do it in more expensive studios. It can cost a lot of money. And so the perception is that it's really for the wealthy. And I think that's justified to some extent. Organic food, it's very, very costly to engage in those types of lifestyles. And so for some people, spiritual but not religious is kind of associated with an affluent lifestyle. And then there's other people that are more ascetic in nature who are also drawn to it, who may not be. But this is my call, this is my rallying cry. Like, we just need so much more research to be done on this. We just don't have enough information yet.
You said a lot, but there's one thing I wrote down that I really want you to address, because it's possible that one could take it that there's spiritual people and then there's religious people. But you point out that some of the people that fall within this rubric, it's like they go to church. They are maybe centered in a traditional religion. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, because I think it's very important.
And I'm sure there's other ways of addressing it. But again, as a sociologist, I tend to come down, or one of my go-tos is to look at these bigger social processes that are happening. And so if we talk just generally about modernization, the impact of modernization, nobody escapes that. Nobody. It's kind of it's an even hand in a certain sense, that the culture as a whole is subjected to it more or less equally. And so try as you may, you're not going to be able to avoid the reality that we're now, shooting people off into space and doing, miracle cures and all these kinds of things that are happening. And so those kinds of things can be very challenging for traditional versions of religion. And so what's tending to happen is people within those traditions, and as a religious studies scholar, any religious studies scholar will tell you that one of the things that's so important to understand about religion is they're not static. They're always changing and adapting. Even very traditional ones have to make some concessions for modernity. And so people are finding very creative ways to stay true to their religious communities, even though there's these things happening that contradict some of the more, some of the tenets of their faith in some cases. Just a very simple example, and I hope I don't draw this example too tightly, but let's consider something like the Catholic Church has a prohibition against abortion, which it does. But for a single mother, let's just say, or women in general, could be a very challenging thing to stick to in this type of culture. And so we're most families have to have two income earners to survive, to get by, to make the get the bills paid by the end of the month. And so, yes, they may want to be very loyal to their faith, but maybe they find themselves in a situation where they have to make a difficult decision. And that's just the impact of the economic reality that we're all living under right now, which is wages are not enough to support people, and particularly families. So maybe people have to tweak things, and that's what we're seeing. And so it's not black and white. It's just absolutely the farthest thing from black and white.
Well, I think that using the Catholic Church is a very, very good example, actually. I mean, on a very simple level, you were talking about abortion, but I mean, birth control is another thing. So there's so many Catholics I know that it's like they just don't do all the things that they're supposed to do according to the tenets, strict tenets of their religion. But even to go a little bit further than that, one of my principal associates is an ex-Jesuit priest. And one of the things, I guess you're never really an ex-Jesuit priest in a certain sense, but in any event, we did a conference, and he was talking about starting up a group for, I guess I'll call them dissatisfied Catholics.
Yeah.
And I was amazed at the people that came to the table and were interested in that. It's difficult to draw these things. And as you say, there's so much, I use the word displacement, maybe it's not an appropriate word. There's so much, the influence of technology, globalization, it affects all of us. And as you say, it affects traditional religion just as much as it affects
I just wanted to jump in and just add this last little piece. A very curious thing I found is that a lot of SBNRs who are parents will send their children they'll go back to church, or they'll want some kind of religious training for their children. I encountered that a lot. So maybe the parent is a person who grew up in a religious tradition, defected, dropped out, and then had children, but they wanted their children to get a religious education.
I want to get back to the whole thing about generations in a minute, but there's one thing that sort of stands out for me that I want to talk about a little bit. Now, and a lot of it, quite frankly, has to do with the generational difference between you and I. So, in other words, when I read your thesis, one of the things that struck me is that you kind of trace the blooming of this category to the counterculture in the 60s. And let me back up a little bit and just ask you the question. Many people who write about this, and not just yourself, trace the growth of SBNRs to the 1960s and the heyday of the counterculture. So the question I have for you, in your view, Siobhan, what is it about this particular time that contributed to the growth of this segment?
I don't actually trace SBNR to the counterculture. I think the counterculture was an important watershed, definitely, because it was a time where that generation, this large, educated generation, were coming into adulthood, and all the things associated with that. But here's what I'll say: the spiritual but not religious phenomenon is, as I've said many times, is just an umbrella term for a lot of different things that are going on that people don't really quite know how they're connected, or what to call them, or what to even call the way they're connected. But a lot of those, so let's take, for example, the New Thought movement. The New Thought movement, the ideas of the New Thought movement are, at least the early 20th century, where that stuff was being taught and worked out, and the antecedents of what we're calling energy medicine now, you can trace back to, say, somebody like Anton Mesmer. So there's these key developments throughout history. You can go back to the Renaissance, or you can even go as far back as the Gnostics if you want to go back that far, and see that this tendency, this idea to view spirituality in its most simple form, that everything is interconnected, that it's all one. This idea of oneness, a seamlessness between the creator and the creation. This idea is not something that popped up in the 1960s, and it has many different ways of being expressed. One of the reasons why Hinduism, or aspects of Hinduism, are popular with people who are spiritual but not religious, is because it has this non-dualistic philosophy, very ancient strand of non-dualistic philosophy that's part of yoga and is part of the Vedas, and so on and so on. So there's a lot of strands that come in that get woven together to bring us to the point where we are today. It's not a distinct phenomenon that it had a clear starting point. But there again, that's how I look at it, as something that got going because it was fanned very strongly by the fires of modernization. The modern climate that encourages individualism, this is a huge thing. This more individualistic society is very compatible with spiritual but not religious. So just to say a little thing there about your earlier question of Is it a global phenomenon? Well, you're much more likely to find it in an individualistic society than you are a collectivist society, or even collectivist segments of individualistic society. So individualism is, and I don't mean that in a negative sense, but freedom, basic human freedoms. I can pick what I want to believe. Nobody's going to tell me otherwise, right? That is kind of the baseline for having a spiritual exploration.
When we talked earlier offline, you talked a lot about the millennial generation and how they're maybe a little different than other generations in terms of their spiritual or religious practice.
Yeah,
Can you say a little bit
really
about this group, what they're doing?
For us to start, as a community that's interested in these issues, to start to find ways to support millennials. In my generation, my parents, they grew up religious. I didn't, but it's only one generation away. Millennials may not have had anyone in their family going to church for one or two generations, or maybe longer. And so they come to their adult years without any religious education in many cases. I like to tell the story of teaching an online course where the assignment asked students to read Genesis. And my inbox exploded with people asking me what Genesis was. I mean, it was incomprehensible to me that you wouldn't know what Genesis was. And that was a real eye-opener. And the things that we assume that people know, they may not know. And this is even more true with millennials. So the point is, not that they're ignorant, but just that they're not educated about religion. And then you have the secularization of the school system. And so they come out as adults and they just don't really know what to think. And then they're faced with a very, very a spiritual marketplace, as it's sometimes called, that's very diverse, very vast. I've heard stories from millennials about being ripped off, having, paid for things. They don't know whether it's credible or not. They don't know who to trust. They don't have a critical lens for looking at this. They just are kind of guessing. And so that's, where I think that people who do have religious education, whether they're spiritual directors or academics, or recognizing that this is a generation that is seeking some kind of clarification. And so in the baby boomer era, the movement was from restricted choices to greater choices. But millennials have as many choices as they want. They have more choice than they can possibly deal with. So their journey is from choice to clarity. It's a very different type of progression. And so within that, the term spirituality is it's disintegrating even further, is what's happening, because I've spoken to many millennials, and I don't want to say this is a well-researched position, but my impression is that they associate spirituality with something that's not of their generation. It's kind of, for them, kind of old school. And so they're moving away from the term altogether. And so once that happens, that's what I mean about spiritual but not religious. We're rapidly losing sight. We're losing our handholds on this thing. So once that starts to happen, the kind of disintegration of what we call spirituality, and it becomes so seamlessly embedded with their lifestyle in some cases that it's just how they live. This is what I've heard them say, is that they may not even, if you ask them what they believe, they may not really be able to answer that, but they know what they like, and they like experiences, definitely. Anyway, it's a big topic. It's a whole other conversation, the millennials, but yes, this is the last thing I'll say about it. There is a bit of a conflation, of drawing together of the sacred and the spiritual, or the sacred and the secular, in a very new and possibly uncomfortable way for people who aren't accustomed to it with the millennials.
I had a recent discussion with a guy who wrote a book called Confessions of a Secular Jesus. To some extent, reveres religion and its role in society. And the question that we explore, which I want to explore with you a little bit, let's take it for granted, or at least for this conversation, that religious practice and religious institutions are in the process perhaps of a slow decline. So the question is, what takes its place, or what are SBNR doing to match the sort of civil involvement that religion plays and religious people do?
that was the whole topic that I did my PhD on, is the social ethic of religiously unaffiliated spirituality. And the reason why I did that was because the critique was a very virulent critique against the spiritual seekers, saying they basically didn't do anything for anybody else. They were narcissists, and that they were basically taking society down the drain. And I thought, well, it's such an extreme position. Of course, it can't be true. And so that's what I did my research on. Well, what are the social values of this group? And the social values, in an absolute most simplest form, is that SBNRs believe everything is interconnected. And I have a post on my blog about Bernie Sanders and why he was so popular with the Millennials. That was the language he spoke. This oneness, this idea of oneness. People are all interconnected. When you harm your neighbor, you harm yourself. And so it's not as though there is no ethical compass for SBNRs, but what does that actually mean in terms of non-traditional forms of civic engagement is a more difficult question to answer. My research didn't show that the people I interviewed anyway were any less civically engaged than other Canadians. So I think we can safely say that these people are good citizens. They're involved. They're engaged pretty much in the same way as the majority of other people. But it's harder to nail down what that looks like without some form of institutional involvement. Maybe somebody's looking after somebody else's child after school one week. They do tend to prefer informal types of commitments. And so again, you get into a measurement problem. I think we're still waiting to see how this rolls out. Politically speaking, I think that progressives or the left have to do a better job of working together and supporting each other to make this more visible in a broader sense. I don't think it's necessarily the job of, I don't think spirituality per se is going to be up to the job of doing what religious organizations have historically done. But there are other institutions that SBNRs are involved with that could possibly do that, if enough of them joined and were of like mind.
There's so much we could talk about this, but I want to close with a big question, and just take your time in answering it, if you would, because I do think it's a big question. There's a growth of this category we've been talking about for the last 45 minutes or so. In your sense, Siobhan Chandler, what does the growth of this category tell us about what's going on in the larger society? What is the meaning of this emergence?
Religion always does mirror society. At the very least, what it tells us is that we're living in a society where people are demanding greater freedom, greater personal freedom. People value some sort of experience of the sacred that they feel is denied to them in religious organization. That may or may not be true, but that's often the perception. I think this is just Siobhan saying this. Maybe not everyone will agree, but I feel like we live in a culture that is deadening. It's a work culture. Like, we go off to work 5 days a week or whatever it is, most of us, some working longer hours to bring in the bacon to keep the whole thing going. And in that context where you have less pleasure, in theory, for me, the paradox is that we live in a society where there are all these recreational options, but how much energy do people have after they've parented and worked to engage in any of that, if they can afford it? And so spirituality, I think, is fulfilling or filling a need that people have to feel like there's some meaning to this world that we've created. Modernization has an ugly side to it, a very, very ugly side to it, that we're trapped in being almost robotic and having to just go out and work and keep it all going. And so I think spirituality is a hope that there's a way to transform the culture, that these inner experiences aren't just a little flash in the pan, but that they connect people to each other and to something bigger. And that through connecting to something bigger, each other, that there's a way to change how we live. Because how we live isn't working. That's manifest. We're not doing a good job of keeping the planet healthy enough to support life. So what can people do? What can you do when you're working 40, 50 hours a week? And maybe you only are meditating in your house by yourself, but if you're trying to connect to that something bigger, then you're maybe doing something to contribute to an improvement in the society. At the very least, there's a hope that you'll have something in common with other people who are doing those same sorts of things, and in some way create a community, or at least a community consciousness to change things. I think it's about change.
That concludes my interview with Siobhan Chandler. Speaking with Siobhan made me reflect on the types of people who've attended Diversity and Spirituality Network events. I suppose, depending on how you look at it, most of these explorers were SBNRs, but there are others who are very much rooted within a traditional religion, and still others who are secularists, but very much interested in finding internal and external ways of dealing with the challenges of the broad category of diversity. Perhaps what unites all of us is this desire to experience the sacred in an increasingly secular age, and to do so on our terms, without dogma or externally imposed belief systems. In any event, I hope to speak with Siobhan again, in particular to explore a subject she just touched upon, how today's millennial generation are defining the sacred. Thanks for listening, and next week we'll be talking with Tom Daly, an early pioneer of what Wikipedia calls the mythopoetic men's movement.
What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is spirituality? Spirituality. Spirituality. How do they divert? How do they divert? How do they divert? How do they convert? How do they convert? How do they convert? How are we different?